in December of 1883 on the frozen Dakota frontier. While every other settler stacked cordwood high and huddled around stoves, Brandon Tull was building something strange. He was constructing a brick bed with a firebox beneath it. A Chinese railroad laborer, shunned by the town, had shown him how. Neighbors laughed. But as the mercury plunged to 40 below, one question hung over that cabin. Would Brandon's eastern bed save his children or suffocate them? Brandon Tull's wife and 2 children relied on him to outlast the Dakota winter, a killer that didn't care about good intentions. The town trusted only firewood, but Brandon had watched a Chinese laborer, a man they despised, keep his family warm through a freeze with a brick bed heated from below, a Kang. So he built one. The neighbors mocked him, yet the danger wasn't just the cold. A crack in the chimney could fill the cabin with odorless smoke, killing them in their sleep. Brandon had staked his family's lives on a foreigner's forgotten secret, and the first real storm was gathering on the horizon. In the fall of 1883, a Chinese railroad laborer named Wu Liang was living in a tar paper shack at the edge of Willow Creek, Dakota Territory. The town had decided what Wu was worth the moment he stepped off the Central Pacific spur line. Not much. White men called him a celestial, a coolie, a leftover from the railroad building crews who should have gone back to California and stayed there. Wu was not the first Chinese man the settlers had seen, but he was the only one who refused to leave. He spoke some English, kept to himself, and survived on what little he could earn breaking sod for the freight depot. He slept in a corner of that shack on a raised platform of brick and clay that no one ever bothered to examine. Brandon Tull found him by accident. On a bitter October morning, Brandon was hauling a broken plow blade back toward the smithy when he saw Wu's chimney coughing white smoke from a shack that looked too small to store enough firewood for a single night. Frost stood a quarter-inch thick on the grass, yet Wu stood outside in a cotton shirt with no coat, calm as a man in springtime. Brandon stopped his wagon and stared. The Chinaman's shack had no woodpile, no stacked cordwood against the wall. Just a few twisted branches beside the door. That made no sense. On the Dakota plains, a man without firewood was a dead man before November. So Brandon walked up, and Wu invited him inside. The warmth hit him first. Not the sharp, uneven heat of a potbelly stove, but a deep, steady warmth that seemed to rise from the floor itself. Wu's sleeping platform occupied half the room, a raised bed made of the same local clay that farmers cursed for its stubbornness. Underneath, a low firebox glowed with a small, patient fire. Wu showed him the flue, a sealed brick tunnel that snaked back and forth beneath the platform, carrying heat across every inch of the clay surface before venting up a narrow chimney. The smoke never entered the room. The fire consumed almost no fuel. Wu slept on top of it every night, even when the temperature outside dropped far below zero. He called it a Kang. His family had used one in China for 4 generations. Brandon understood almost immediately that this was the most important secret he had ever been given. His own cabin, a quarter-mile away, leaked heat through every mud-chinked crack. His wife, Eliza, spent the nights wrapped in wool blankets while their 2 children, Henry, 6, and little Sarah, just 3, shivered in a loft that never stayed warm. He was already rationing his firewood, and the worst of the winter had not yet arrived. So Brandon did something that most men in Willow Creek would consider beneath them. He asked a Chinese laborer to teach him, and Wu agreed. For 3 weeks, Brandon worked beside Wu in that shack, learning the geometry of trapped heat. The bed itself needed to be 2 feet tall, at least 6 feet wide and 8 feet long, big enough for a family of 4. The firebox sat at one end, small, just 12 inches square, with a cast-iron door salvaged from a broken cook stove. From there, the flue split into 3 channels, the main central channel running straight beneath the sleeping platform, and 2 smaller side channels that curved outward near the foot of the bed. Wu drew the path in the dirt with a stick. The fire's breath must travel 10 feet before reaching the chimney, losing every degree of heat into the brick along the way. If the flue was too short, smoke would exit too hot and waste fuel. If the angles were wrong, the draft would choke and carbon gas would seep into the room. Wu's voice turned hard when he reached that part. "You smell nothing," he said. "No color, no taste, One night you not wake up. That warning stayed with Brandon more than any other. He repeated it to Eliza that evening. She sat beside the stove, her face drawn with worry, while Henry practiced carving a small wooden horse on the floor. "Is it safe?" she asked. Brandon had no answer that would satisfy her because safety on the frontier was never a guarantee. Firewood could run out. Stoves could smoke. Children could freeze in their beds. He was betting that Wu's strange brick bed was safer than the alternatives, but he did not yet know that for certain. The construction took nearly a month. Brandon dug clay from the creek bank behind the cabin, mixed it with straw and sand, and formed bricks one by hand. Henry carried water in a small bucket while Sarah watched from the porch wrapped in a wool blanket. Brandon built the platform against the east wall, directly across from the front door, so the rising heat would flow toward the rest of the room. He laid the firebox with the best stones he could find mortared tight. Then came the flue channels, precise, sloping paths that required constant measurement. Wu visited twice to inspect the angles. Each time he placed his palm flat against the drying brick and waited, as if listening for the fire that wasn't there yet. He adjusted nothing. He only nodded, then walked back to his shack while the town glared at him. The neighbors watched Brandon's strange construction with growing ridicule. Ephraim Cobb, a stocky German immigrant who ran the dry goods store, stopped his wagon alongside the Tull claim one afternoon and laughed until his face turned red. "You building a tomb for your family, Tull?" he called out. "A fire under the bed, that's what lunatics in asylums dream up." Other men joined in. They spoke in the mercantile about how the Chinaman had filled Brandon's head with oriental foolishness. No decent Christian family slept on top of an oven. It was unnatural. It was dangerous. A woman from the church circle warned Eliza privately that the heat would weaken her children's constitutions, make them sickly and prone to fever. No one offered to help, but the most weighty warning came from Doc Albright, the closest thing Willow Creek had to a physician. He had seen chimney fires kill whole families in the mining camps of Pennsylvania. He arrived one evening uninvited, stood in Brandon's doorway and studied the half-finished bed with deep suspicion. "Carbon," he said quietly, "odorless, deadly. A man falls asleep and never wakes. I've buried 4 in one morning from a bad flu." He looked at Brandon with the weary eyes of a man who had pulled too many bodies from cabins. "You test this thing before you put your children on it, you hear." "You tested hard," Brandon nodded. "But testing hard would mean inviting danger into the house before the cold came, and that was a gamble of its own." The first true cold snap arrived on November 27th. The temperature dropped to 10 below overnight. Brandon lit the Kang firebox at sundown, a small blaze of split pine and dried grass. For an hour the bed remained cold. He pressed his palm to the brick, feeling the chill unchanged beneath his hand. Henry asked if it was broken. Eliza said nothing. Then slowly warmth began to seep upward through the clay. By midnight the surface was hot to the touch, almost too hot to sit on directly. The cabin air grew warm and steady for the first time since they had built it. The children slept on the platform with blankets beneath them, and Brandon lay awake listening to the silence, searching for any smell of smoke. There was none. Then, at 3 in the morning, he heard it. A sharp crack, not a pop from the fire, but a deeper structural sound. He scrambled off the bed and pulled the lantern close. A hairline fissure had opened along the mortar line near the central flue, just wide enough to let a faint wisp of white smoke thread into the room. The smell hit him instantly, acrid bitter. He threw open the front door, dragging the freezing air inside. Eliza woke coughing. The children cried. He carried them out into the snow while the Kang's fire died and the smoke settled to the floorboards. By dawn, the crack had cooled and shrunk and closed again as if it had never existed, but Brandon knew the truth. The Kang had nearly killed them on its first real night. Wu returned that morning. He examined the crack without expression, then pointed to the clay mixture Brandon had used. "Too little sand," he said. "Expands too much." He showed Brandon how to mix a thin slip of clay and ash and work it into the crack while the brick was still warm. The seam would seal itself under heat, he explained. It would never open again if the mixture was right. Brandon applied the slip exactly as instructed, pressing it into the gap with his thumbs while the sun climbed over the frozen prairie. He did not tell Eliza that he was terrified. But from that moment on, every night he lit the fire, he lay awake listening for the sound of cracking brick. The real test arrived on December 10th. The sky turned to iron, and the temperature began a long, hard slide that would drop to 40 below and stay there for a full week. The wind stripped exposed skin in seconds. Horses left standing outside developed ice crystals in their lungs. In Willow Creek, men dragged their stovepipes from supply crates and barricaded doors with frozen quilts. The storm was still a day away when Ephraim Cobb saw Brandon carrying fresh straw toward the cabin and called out his last warning. That Chinese contraption will freeze solid and crack wide open, Tull. And when it does, that smoke will fill your family's lungs and bury them before I can dig a hole in the frozen ground. Brandon did not answer. He walked inside, bolted the door, and looked at the Kang. Eliza was already placing blankets on the surface. Henry and Sarah sat on the straw mattress, watching their father with wide, trusting eyes. Outside, the wind began to howl. Night was coming faster than it should have. Brandon knelt before the firebox, struck a lucifer, and watched the flames catch. The heat curled through the hidden flues. He pressed his hand to the brick and waited. The first tendrils of warmth touched his palm. Then in the stillness he heard it again. A sound from beneath the bed. Not a crack this time. Something else. A deep grinding thud, as if the frozen earth itself was shifting under their feet. The fire flickered. Brandon dropped to his knees and pressed his ear against the brick. The grinding settled into a low, deep hum, as if the frozen ground itself was groaning under the storm's weight. He ran his palm across the mortar line he had sealed only weeks before. No cracks, no smoke. The Kang was holding. He let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, then pulled Sarah and Henry closer to the center of the warm clay platform. Outside, the blizzard slammed into the cabin with a fury greater than any storm he had known in 10 years on the plains. The walls shuddered. The single window sealed itself under a white shell of ice. But inside the cabin, the heat remained steady, pulsing upward from the firebox through the hidden flues beneath their bodies. For the first hour, Eliza lay rigid, her hand clutching a damp rag pressed to her mouth, terrified that odorless poison was seeping into the air. But the children slept. Henry's small chest rose and fell without a cough. Sarah's cheeks stayed pink. Brandon checked the firebox every 30 minutes, adding a single split log at a time, far less than a stove would demand. The Kang consumed fuel with a patience that seemed almost unnatural. By midnight, the temperature outside had plunged to 20 below and was still falling. Yet the water bucket in the corner, a few feet from the platform, had not even formed a skin of ice. Eliza finally let the rag fall. She looked at Brandon with eyes that held a fragile, unfamiliar hope. Maybe it was working, but the blizzard had another weapon. Around 2 in the morning, a violent downdraft hammered the chimney. Smoke burst backward through the firebox door, filling the room with a gray cloud. Brandon lunged forward, searing his palm on the iron latch as he slammed the door shut. The smoke had been brief, but the acrid bite lingered. He coughed, waving his arm. The Kang's flue had kept the gas from pooling inside the bed, but the chimney itself was losing its draw, overpowered by the wind's weight. If the draft reversed for more than a few seconds, the room would fill with carbon monoxide. He had to fix the chimney, or they were dead. He tied a rope around his waist, just as Parker Vale had done years before in a different storm, and handed the other end to Eliza. She did not speak. Her face was pale with terror, but she wound the rope around her wrist and braced her feet against the platform. Brandon opened the door into the roaring white void. The cold crushed the breath from his lungs. He crawled along the cabin wall, fingers numb within seconds, feeling for the ladder he had leaned against the roof. The chimney pipe rose only 3 feet above the ridge. He found it by touch, ice already crusted thick around the cap. The downdraft was so strong it was sucking snow sideways into the pipe. He pulled the tin deflector plate from his coat pocket, the same plate Wu had taught him to cut and shape for just this moment, and lashed it to the cap with frozen wire. The wind's pressure shifted instantly, roaring upward instead of down. The chimney coughed a plume of white smoke and then began drawing cleanly. Brandon collapsed back through the door, his beard a mask of ice. Eliza pulled him onto the Kang, pressing her body against his to restore warmth. It had taken less than 2 minutes. It had nearly killed him. By the third day of the blizzard, Willow Creek had become a landscape of smothered wagons and buried fences. The storm refused to release its grip. Other cabins across the settlement were running low on wood, their stoves consuming fuel at a desperate rate just to keep a single room above freezing. Ephraim Cobb's store became an emergency shelter, but the two stoves inside could not keep pace with the cold bleeding through the plank walls. Frostbite crept into exposed fingers and ears. Doc Albright treated 7 cases in one afternoon, wrapping frozen extremities in cool, wet cloths while the wind screamed outside. But in the Tull cabin, the Kang required so little fuel that the small stockpile of wood beside the platform barely shrank. Brandon had moved it inside weeks ago, a precaution that now seemed prophetic. They had enough for days, maybe a week. The clay bed radiated a steady, penetrating warmth that wrapped the entire room. They cooked beans and salt pork on a flat stone placed over the firebox. The children played on the platform, drawing shapes in the thin layer of straw that covered the brick. None of them showed a single sign of frostnip. It was, Eliza whispered one evening, the first winter she had ever felt safe inside her own home. On the morning of the 4th day, the wind died. The silence was so sudden it woke Brandon from a deep sleep. He climbed from the Kang, pulled on his coat, and forced the door open against a waist-high drift. The sky held a pale, milky gray light. The snow had sculpted wild shapes around the cabin, but the chimney rose clear, a thin thread of smoke curling straight upward. Brandon waded through the powder toward the main settlement. The first person he saw was Ephraim Cobb, standing in the doorway of his store, his face hollow with exhaustion. 3 lanterns burned inside, flickering over huddled families wrapped in every blanket they owned. A child was crying, her fingers blackened with frostbite. 2 men were trying to dig out the woodpile behind the store, but the logs were frozen into a single block of ice. Cobb looked at Brandon, at the color still in his cheeks, and his expression shifted from exhaustion to confusion. No one in that store had slept warm in 3 nights, yet Brandon Tull looked as if he had merely endured a cold evening. Doc Albright emerged from the back room, his apron stained with blood from a frostbite amputation. He stopped when he saw Brandon. For a long moment, the old doctor said nothing. Then he walked forward and seized Brandon's hands, turning them over, examining the fingertips. No damage, no white patches. He pulled back Brandon's sleeve and felt the skin of his forearm. It was warm. Albright's voice cracked. "How?" Brandon did not answer with words. He simply led the doctor back to the cabin. Albright stood in the open doorway, staring at the raised brick platform, at the 2 children playing contentedly on its surface, at Eliza stirring a pot of broth that simmered from the gentle heat below. The old physician knelt and laid his palm flat against the clay. He stayed there silent for nearly a minute. Then he looked up. "The Chinaman taught you this," Brandon nodded. Albright's jaw tightened, not with scorn, with the pained recognition of a man who had buried too many children because of ignorance. But the storm's aftermath did not bring gratitude to everyone. That same afternoon, a group of men gathered at the livery stable. They had lost livestock. Their families had suffered frostbite. One man's wife had lost 3 fingers. They needed someone to blame. And the most obvious target had always been waiting at the edge of town in a tar paper shack. Wu Liang had not emerged during the blizzard because he had no need to. His own Kang, smaller and older, had kept him perfectly warm with a pile of dried buffalo chips and a single armload of twisted branches. When the men marched past his shack, they saw the smoke curling from his chimney, the same thin, calm smoke they had seen rising from the Tull cabin. One of them, a bitter Swede named Johansson, picked up a frozen stone and hurled it through Wu's single window. The glass shattered inward. Wu appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. No one spoke. The mob's silence was more dangerous than any words. Then Johansson raised a torch, and the frozen air flickered with orange light. Brandon saw the flames from his cabin window. He grabbed his coat and ran. He did not run toward the mob as a hero. He ran as a man who understood with chilling clarity that the same secret that had saved his children's lives was about to get a good man killed. And the Kang, still radiating its quiet, patient warmth behind him, offered no protection against the hatred gathering in the dark. The fire that had saved his family could not stop the fire that was about to consume Wu Liang. Brandon burst through the circle of men and planted himself between Wu and the torch. The flames licked the air inches from his face. Johansson stood at the front, his broad shoulders hunched against the cold, the burning brand smoking in his grip. Behind him, a dozen men shifted in the snow, their faces half-lit by firelight. Some carried axe handles. Others held nothing but clenched fists. Brandon's lungs burned from the sprint, but he did not move. "You're not going to burn him," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. Johansson's lip curled. "That coolie almost killed your own family with his devil heater, and you stand there defending him. You're as crazy as he is." Wu Liang had not retreated into his shack. He stood in the doorway, the shattered glass glinting at his feet, watching the mob with the same unreadable calm he had always worn. He did not plead. He did not cower. That unnerved the men more than any threat could have. Brandon raised his hands, palms open, and turned so the entire circle could see his face. "My family is alive," he said slowly. "My children have no frostbite. My wife is warm for the first winter since we came to this territory. The Kang saved us. Wu saved us." He pointed toward the dark shape of his cabin, barely visible against the snow. "I'm standing here right now because of what he taught me." A murmur rippled through the mob, uncertainty. The men had seen the Tull cabin smoke rising steady through the storm when their own chimneys had clogged and frozen. They had seen Doc Albright walk back to town shaking his head, not in disapproval but in wonder. Johansson spat into the snow. "You got lucky. That thing is a death trap. The Chinaman filled your head with pagan foolishness and it will kill you yet, but not before we handle this." He raised the torch higher. Then a new voice cut through the night. "Lower that flame, Johansson." Doc Albright stepped through the snow, his medical bag still in one hand, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. The men parted for him without a word. Albright had pulled their children into the world, had stitched their wounds, had sat vigil beside their fevered wives. In Willow Creek, his authority was absolute. He stopped beside Brandon and faced the mob. "I examined the Tull family an hour ago. Every one of them has clear lungs, warm extremities, and healthy color. In 3 days of storm, they burned less wood than you did in one night. The Kang works." He let the silence hang. "And if any of you had bothered to ask, you would know that this technology is older than the Roman Empire. It has kept millions alive through winters far worse than ours. The only foolishness here is your own." The torch in Johansson's hand wavered. He looked from Albright to the men behind him and saw his support crumbling. One by one, the axe handles lowered. The ground shifted beneath the mob's feet. The man they had come to punish was no longer a threat. He was the answer to a question they had been too proud to ask. Brandon turned to Wu. "Please," he said, "show them." Wu stepped forward for the first time. He walked past the shattered glass, past the men who had come to kill him, and knelt beside a pile of frozen mud bricks stacked against the shack. He had been making more, preparing for a demand he must have known would come. He pointed to the bricks, then to the firebox visible through the broken window. "You want to survive next winter?" he asked in his quiet, accented English. "Then learn to listen." The tide turned in that instant. The men who had marched with Johansson began asking questions. How much fuel did it need? How long to build? Could it heat a room twice this size? Johansson cursed and threw his torch into the snow, where it hissed and died. He vanished into the darkness without another word. But the others stayed. They stayed until the moon rose high and Wu had drawn 3 different flue patterns into the frozen dirt with a stick. The Chinese laborer who had been shunned for 2 years was now the most important man in Willow Creek. But the victory came with a cost that no one expected. 3 days later, a rider arrived from the county seat with a telegram. The railroad had cut wages again, and a wave of anti-Chinese sentiment was sweeping the territory. Vigilante committees in neighboring towns were burning Chinese quarters to the ground. A cleansing had already killed 5 Chinese laborers 2 counties east. The news hit Willow Creek like a second blizzard. The same men who had threatened Wu's life were now terrified of what might arrive from outside if word spread that they harbored a Chinese man. And they were even more terrified of what might happen if they handed him over and lost the Kang knowledge forever. The tension in the town twisted into something new, not hate but desperate, clawing self-preservation. Brandon found Wu that evening sitting beside his repaired window. "They're afraid for you," Brandon said. Wu looked up. "They afraid of losing me, not same." It was the most bitter truth either of them had ever spoken. The town did not love Wu Liang, they needed him, and the distinction was sharp enough to cut. Ephraim Cobb called a meeting in his store that same night. Every homesteader within 10 miles crowded into the narrow room, their breath fogging the air despite the struggling stoves. Cobb slammed his fist on the counter. "We can't protect him forever, and we can't afford to lose what he knows. There's only one way to keep that secret safe." Pointed at Wu, who stood in the corner with Brandon. "He builds one for every family here. Before the next winter, we pay him fair, we feed him. And if any outsider comes looking for a Chinese to string up, we tell them the truth. There's no coolie here, just a hired mason who's under contract to 20 families." The room fell silent. Then one by one, the hands went up. Every man signed. The despised immigrant was about to become the most sought-after builder in Dakota Territory. Wu Liang built 10 Kangs that spring and summer. Each one was a variation on his original design, adapted to the shape of the cabin, the direction of the wind, the size of the family. He taught Brandon how to fire the bricks in a pit kiln, how to mix the mortar with the right measure of sand and ash, how to slope the flue so the draft pulled without a single wisp of smoke leaking into the room. He was paid in grain, lumber, and coin. He saved every penny. And when the work was done, he bought a small plot of land at the edge of Willow Creek and built his own cabin with the largest Kang any of them had ever seen. It was his quiet statement, "I am not leaving." The town that tried to burn him out now relied on his survival for their own. But the true test was still to come. Winter arrived early that year, and it was brutal. Temperatures plunged to 40 below and stayed there for 11 days straight. In the surrounding settlements, families froze to death in their beds. A wagon load of supplies from the rail depot was found half buried, the driver dead at the reins, his hands frozen to the leather. But in Willow Creek, the Kangs kept burning. The town survived. The secret that had once been a source of ridicule had become the foundation of their existence. And in the middle of that frozen hell, a delegation arrived from the neighboring county. They had heard rumors of the strange heated beds. They wanted to see them. They wanted to hire the man who built them. Wu Liang stood on the porch of his cabin, watching them approach through the snow, and for the first time since he had stepped off that rail spur, he allowed himself a small, quiet smile. The student who had come to him for survival had now made him indispensable. The town that had despised him now called him neighbor. And the Kang, born in ancient China to warm peasants and emperors alike, was about to spread across the Dakota frontier. But the story does not end there. Hidden beneath the brick floor of Wu's own Kang, there was a second chamber, one he had never shown anyone. It was not for heat. It was for escape. A narrow tunnel that burrowed 6 feet down and 20 feet west before surfacing beneath the floor of an abandoned soddy. He had built it alone in the dark after watching his window shatter. Wu knew something that no one else in Willow Creek would admit. Winter always breaks, but hatred never does. And he was determined to be ready when it came again. When spring finally broke the iron grip of that second winter, Willow Creek was still standing. Not a single family had frozen to death. Not a single child had lost fingers to frostbite. The Kangs had performed beyond what even Wu Liang had promised. And the numbers told a story that no one could ignore. In neighboring settlements, the death toll from the 11-day freeze reached 17 souls. Entire cabins had become tombs. But in Willow Creek, the only casualty was a horse that had broken its leg in a drift. The difference was not luck. It was masonry, clay, and the patient design of a man they had once tried to burn alive. Brandon Tull walked through the thawing mud of the main road on a morning in late March, and what he saw would have been unthinkable just 1 year earlier. Wu Liang was standing on the porch of the general store, a cup of coffee in his hand, laughing at something Ephraim Cobb had said. The same Cobb who had mocked the Kang as oriental foolishness now kept a pot of coffee warm for Wu every morning. The same men who had marched with Johansson now greeted Wu by name, tipping their hats. The transformation was not sentimental. It was practical. Wu had saved their families, and on the frontier, survival earned a respect deeper than any prejudice. But the real shift happened in April, when a letter arrived from the territorial governor's office. A bureaucrat in Bismarck had heard rumors of the heated beds that allowed a Dakota town to survive the worst winter in a decade. He wanted a full report. He wanted diagrams. He wanted to know if the design could be standardized for new settlers arriving from the east. Wu could not read the letter himself. His English was spoken, not written, so Brandon read it aloud to him in the cabin with the big Kang. When Brandon finished, Wu sat in silence for a long moment. Then he said, almost to himself, "They want learn from Chinese man now." There was no bitterness in his voice, just a weary, quiet irony that had been carved into him during 10 years of being called coolie. Brandon wrote the report. Wu dictated every detail, from the slope of the flue to the mixture of clay and sand, from the dimensions of the firebox to the technique for firing bricks in a pit kiln. Brandon drew the diagrams on brown wrapping paper with a charcoal stick. He sent the packet east on the next freight wagon. Months later, a copy of that report would be printed in a settler's guide circulated across the territory. Wu Liang's name was on the cover, not as a coolie, as the inventor of the Dakota Kang. The summer of 1885 became a building season unlike anything the territory had seen. Word spread. Homesteaders from 3 counties away arrived in Willow Creek asking for the Chinese mason who could build a bed that kept children warm through 40 below. Wu could have gouged them. He could have named any price and desperate families would have paid it. Instead, he set a fair wage and trained 2 local men to assist him. One of them was Johansson's younger brother, a quiet carpenter who had been ashamed of his siblings' violence and wanted to make amends. The other was Henry Tull, Brandon's 7-year-old son, who carried bricks and learned to mix mortar by feel. Wu taught the boy the same way he had taught Brandon, patiently, meticulously, with the same warning about carbon gas that he had spoken on that first autumn day. You smell nothing, no color, no taste. One night you not wake up. Henry never forgot it. By the end of that summer, Wu had built 23 Kangs across the territory. Each one was a variation on the original, adapted to the cabin it served. Some had double fireboxes for larger families. Some had flues that curved around interior walls to heat 2 rooms. One, built for Doc Albright, included a warming shelf for medical instruments and a raised ledge where frostbitten patients could lie suspended above the gentle heat. The designs were functional, but they were also beautiful in their economy. Wu shaped the clay with his bare hands, smoothing the surfaces until they gleamed, and the finished platforms looked less like makeshift beds and more like permanent architecture. The Kang had become the foundation of frontier survival, and Wu was its master builder. But the hidden chamber beneath Wu's own bed remained a secret. He had dug it after the night of the mob, working alone by lantern light while the rest of the town slept. The tunnel ran 6 feet down into the frozen earth and 20 feet west, surfacing beneath the floorboards of an abandoned soddy that had belonged to a failed homesteader. He had packed the walls with stone and braced the ceiling with salvaged railroad ties. He had stocked it with blankets, dried meat, and a small barrel of water. He had never used it. He hoped he never would. But every night before he climbed onto the warm clay, he checked the trapdoor beneath the rug, because Wu understood something that the white settlers around him were only beginning to learn. Acceptance was not the same thing as safety. The same townsfolk who now tipped their hats had once held torches. The same governor's office that now praised his work had once enforced the Chinese Exclusion Act. The Kang had made him useful, but usefulness was a fragile shield, and Wu had lived too long on the margins to trust that the welcome would last forever. The trapdoor was never needed, not for Wu at least. But in the winter of 1886, it saved a life anyway. A blizzard caught a young family traveling through the territory at night. Their wagon overturned in a drift. The father, a Swede named Lindberg, carried his 2-year-old daughter through waist-deep snow, searching for any sign of shelter. He saw a faint glow through the whiteout and stumbled toward it half dead, his daughter blue and still against his chest. The glow came from Wu's window. Wu pulled them inside, placed the child on the warm Kang, and covered her with every blanket he owned. The father collapsed beside her. For 2 days, the storm trapped them inside that cabin. Wu fed them from his stores and kept the firebox burning low and steady. The child survived. The father survived. When they finally dug out and reached Willow Creek, the story spread. The Chinese Mason had saved a white child from certain death. And for the first time, the town saw Wu not as a useful foreigner but as a neighbor. Brandon and Eliza invited Wu to dinner at the Tull cabin that spring. The children were older now. Henry could read and write, and Sarah, who had been only 3 during that first terrifying winter, was now a bright-eyed 6-year-old who loved to help her mother knead dough. Wu sat at their table and ate stew with them, and he did not say much, but his presence said everything. The family that had gambled their lives on a foreigner's forgotten secret had become the family that welcomed that foreigner as their own. The years passed. Willow Creek grew from a scattering of claims into a proper town with a schoolhouse, a church, and a rail spur that brought new settlers every season. The Kang became standard practice in the region, passed down from one builder to the next. Wu trained a dozen masons before he finally retired. Brandon's son Henry grew up to become a builder himself, and every Kang he constructed carried the same warning his father had taught him. The fire must breathe, the flue must slope, and the carbon must never be given a pathway into the room where children sleep. Wu Liang died in his own bed, on his own Kang, in the winter of 1901. He was 72 years old. The entire town attended his funeral, standing in the deep snow while the preacher spoke words over the grave of a man who had once been called a coolie and was now called a founder. Ephraim Cobb, now an old man himself, offered a eulogy that surprised everyone. "He didn't just build us beds," Cobb said, his voice cracking in the cold air. "He taught us that the people we fear the most might be the ones holding the secret to our survival." Brandon Tull lived to see his grandchildren sleep on Kangs. He never forgot the night he had lain awake listening for cracks in the mortar, the night the smell of searing rock had filled his lungs with terror. He never forgot the mob at Wu's door or the torch in Johansson's hand. But more than anything else, he remembered the moment Wu placed his palm flat against the drying brick and waited, as if listening for the fire that wasn't there yet. It was the same patience Brandon had learned to adopt, the same quiet attentiveness that had saved his family. The same secret that had transformed a despised laborer into the most important man on the plains. And hidden beneath the floor of the old Liang cabin, long after Wu was gone, the tunnel remained. A narrow stone passage leading to an abandoned soddy, its trapdoor perfectly fitted, its walls still packed tight against the earth. It had never been used to escape a mob, but its existence was a testament to a truth that the Dakota frontier could never erase. Wu Liang had not only taught the settlers how to survive the storm, he had also prepared himself to survive them. And in the end, the same wisdom that saved a town from freezing to death also allowed a single Chinese immigrant to outlast every threat that came for him. The Kang was never just a bed. It was a lesson in patience, in trust, in the strange and fragile bridge between different worlds that only the coldest winters could build. The Kang spread far beyond Willow Creek. By the turn of the century, variations of Wu Liang's design could be found in homesteads from the Dakotas to Montana, passed from one settler to another like a survival code. The official settler's guide that printed Wu's name did not treat him as an outsider. It treated him as an authority. And in that single fact lay the deeper transformation. A man who had been invisible, then despised, then grudgingly tolerated, had become a teacher whose knowledge shielded an entire generation of pioneers from the coldest winters on the plains. But the question that lingers in the snow-dusted quiet of those abandoned homesteads is not only about masonry and draft angles. It is about what else we might be missing when we refuse to see the people we have already dismissed. Wu Liang did not bring a weapon or a bargaining chip. He brought a bed. And the town that nearly killed him was saved by the warmth of that bed before they could even fully understand what they had been given. The Kang was never a symbol of cultural superiority. It was a quiet, stubborn proof that survival belongs to the curious, not to the certain. Today, the Minnesota Historical Society's archives still hold fragments of those frontier Kangs, chunks of clay and straw, embedded with the fingerprints of immigrants who built them in the dark of northern winters. Those prints are not just artifacts. They are signatures on a contract that the frontier never fully honored but could not survive without. And every frostbitten child who lived because of a heated clay platform was a quiet refutation of the mob that once raised a torch outside a tar paper shack. The story of Brandon Tull and Wu Liang forces a reckoning with something far older than the Dakota Territory. It poses a question that we still struggle to answer in our own time. Do we choose to learn from the people we have been taught to ignore? Or do we let fear decide who gets to speak, even when our own survival might depend on what they have to say? Brandon Tull asked the question in the only way the frontier allowed, with his hands in the mud and his children's lives on the line. Wu Liang answered it by building a bridge of fire and clay between a world that hated him and a world that needed him. And the winter, which had always been the great equalizer on the plains, became the quiet witness to the truth that cold does not care where you were born. It only cares whether you are prepared. If this story unsettles your assumptions, then it has done its work. The Kang is not just a forgotten piece of Americana. It is a mirror. It asks whether the next life-saving idea might already be waiting inside a person you have been trained not to see. Subscribe now to follow more histories of survival that the frontier tried to bury, stories where the margins wrote the center's future, and where the coldest winters forged the warmest bonds.